Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this part 4 of our 3D Scan to Part series, we're going to get into Fusion 360 and we're going to start designing a fender flare. Now, if you skipped the first 3 videos, that's perfectly fine. They were kind of long and they were really looking at the process of scanning the fender, the hood, the bumper, and processing that data to get a mesh. Now, a lot of times, at least throughout this channel's history, I got a lot of questions about where do you get the scan from? Where do you find this data? Which is why I went so long and detailed into those videos, because I really wanted to make sure that we covered that. But now that we're in the software, you can download the data set in the description and follow along if you want. I doubt that many of you out there are building fender flares for a narrow or flat-sided Starion, but if you are, then go ahead and use the scan for your own purposes. I do plan on doing a full body kit for this car, but the purpose of this video series is only looking at the front. So to get started, I want to show you my first attempt on the screen. I was playing around with some shapes and just kind of getting an idea of what I wanted it to look like. This is always a good first step whenever you're thinking about making a body mod or making a wide body fender. Play around with different shapes, look online for different images and inspiration. Thankfully for me, this car came in both a flat side or a narrow and a wide body version. Along its same life, the body changed based on a Group B rally car that was built in 1984, which happens to be the year of the car that I'm working on. And in 86 to 89, there was a factory wide body version. They shared a lot of similarities. There were differences along the way. Things like automatic seatbelts were added in 87. So mine has manual seatbelts, for example, and so did the 86 wide body. But they shared the same bumper, the same air dam, the same hood, with the exception of the 1983 car. And the wide body fenders actually bolt onto this car. I can use the same parts. I can bolt on a fender. I can bolt on the air dam and be good to go. However, that's not really the point of making our own parts. We want them to be unique. We want them to be different. And I really like the fact that the narrow body cars have a unique fender to the wide bodies. So the wide bodies came down and sort of bulged out from here and just had a sort of an opening in the wide body. The narrow-sided cars had a rounded lip on them. And you can see they still carried the hard body line. We can see that in the scan data. So they carried that hard body line and they really had a more of a unique feel to them. So my idea is to carry that same geometry. So I want to carry the sort of the same body lines and use that same lip feature, but make it a wider version. And when we look at this from the front, the seam in the fender where it sort of drops down and the factory wide body comes down and then out, I'm trying to carry that line down and just make the car a bit wider there. I don't know if this will look okay on the car, but that's the basic shape. Now, this is by no means a complete fender. There are things I don't like about it. There are things that need to be finished. So a couple of things that we want to get out of the way is, what are the goals of this series? This is probably not going to be just one video to design this because it does take quite a bit. So we want to understand what the goals are here and what the sort of the whole point of this entire thing is. So the entire goal here is to create models that can be 3D printed, put on the car. And in this case, what I'm looking to do is build a fiberglass plug. So a negative, or I'm sorry, a fiberglass mold, a negative off of this piece, which will be the plug, the positive of what we're trying to create. So building it this way will allow me to decide if I want to blend it into the current fender, if I want to build an over fender that bolts on or rivets on, or how I want to really attach these. There's a lot of variations that we can do there, but that's going to be the general approach here, is to design it, 3D print it in sections, assemble it on the car, and then probably do some body filler, sanding, paint, and stuff over that. It's pretty boring to watch, but that's the approach that I'm taking. And the overall goal for this entire series is not to go through every step of the process, because again, I think it's very rare that somebody is making a wide body fender for a narrow Starion. They're pretty rare, even across the globe. There aren't that many of them out there. So the goal for me is to convey the design approach, the way in which I would approach a design like this, and some of the nuances and differences that we can sort of take away from this. Now, in terms of what I like and what I don't like about this first attempt here, one thing that I don't like is the seam or the line on the car is not staying straight. It's going up and over the fender and back down. And if we go into the freeform body and we take a look here and I go into a box display, it's a little bit hard to see, but these lines go up to meet the fender flare and come back down. Now, if we take a look at the actual car, the scan, that line goes straight through. So that's one of the goals for me, is to keep the body lines parallel like they are on the original and just sort of flare it out. That's one of the goals. The other goal is to figure out how wide I actually want it. So I played around with a couple of different amounts. Right now on the front of this car, it's a 15-inch rim. It's running a 215 tire. If I assume that the suspension geometry is not changing, I don't really want to go too drastically wider on the front where we are steering. So what this means is I'm probably going to go somewhere between 35 and 50 millimeters, so about 1 to 2 inches. That's just kind of the overall approach that I'm going to be taking. And once we get into the design, we'll look at that. But the other thing that I want to consider is that the air dam is going to be coming down lower, because I plan on making another one, and it will come out to meet the wide body. So I need to make sure that the shape that I'm creating down here can be blocked off fairly easily. And the way that the factory one works is the fender actually rolls under and then the air dam meets it. And it's kind of true for the wide body, the factory wide body version. It's a little bit different because the fender does flare out down there. But again, these are the things that I'm looking at. I want to keep those body lines and sort of maintain some of that original nature of the way that this car was designed and not try to mimic just a wide body version. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with a brand new design. As I said, you can download the data set from the description in the video, which already has the mesh in it, but I want to show you the entire process. So to get started, we're going to be in a new document, and on the mesh tab, we're going to use insert mesh. Now for me, in the last video, we saved out the mesh as a 3MF, an OBJ, and an STL. We have all three of those versions. The icons are different just based on what the default for opening these in Windows is. The I icon is Mesh Lab. It happened to attach itself to the OBJ file. This is the 3D print or 3D paint that is Microsoft Window. And the STL is Creality. It's a Creality logo for the 3D printer that I have. So you can pick any one you want, determine which file type you're going to be using for your own. The STL is likely the oldest. I think it originated in 1980s sometime. The OBJ and 3MF files are a little bit newer. They can contain different types of data, but coming out of the XScan Pro software, there's really not going to be any appreciable difference that I can tell. So once we insert the mesh, the specs of your computer are going to determine how well this works. It is a pretty heavy mesh. It is pretty dense, so it probably is going to drag a little bit. But keeping in mind that we did a little bit of work to align this, when I look at it from the right, the scan, it looks good from the right. When I look at it from the front, it looks good from the front. When I look at it from the top, it all looks good from the top. So I'm happy with the alignment that it comes in based on what we did inside of XScan Pro. So I'm going to say OK. And now I have this mesh. If I turn on my origin, you can see the origin is located at the point that was used inside of XScan. Remember when we were doing the end of the last video, I mentioned that we have a point, a line, and a plane. The coordinate system is based on that point. The plane is going to be parallel to the plane that I created based off of the bumper. And the line is used for the X or Y axis orientation. But all that looks good, which means that we're going to have a pretty good time in freeforms working with this. Under the bodies folder, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and make this unselectable. Now it's important that when we're working with freeform models, we don't start out with a very high resolution. We want to make sure that we're doing pretty low res until we're happy with the shape. So I don't really need the mesh to be selectable now. This means that I won't be able to do things like apply an appearance to it if I'm trying to do a render, but that can be toggled on and off at any point in time. And when it is off, it actually does make a little bit of a difference in performance because it's not trying to select anything. So what we're going to do now is move either to the surface or solid tab, find the create form, and we're going to start a new form body. I'm going to view this from the right, and again, we've got a couple major body lines. In this car, we've got a pretty apparent body line at the top. That's the one I'm going to be following to sort of make the overall shape. Then we have this transition here, and again, that's a straight line that comes down. And then we've got the transition to the lower portion of the body, which is actually carried up into the fender. So everything down here carries up into the fender pretty nicely. So the first thing that I do when I'm thinking about something like a body kit, in forms, it's relatively hard for us to get straight edges and maintain those straight edges. It's just a little bit trickier than making sort of organic free-flowing shapes. So we're going to have to be really cautious about those edges that we're working with. So that's one thing that I think about. The second thing that I need to think about is how I want to build this. So there's a couple different approaches. One is to build the fender without the wheel opening and build the wheel opening separate, and then we can combine them as surfaces doing that work in the surface tools. That is one way that makes it a little bit easier to deal with these transitions. However, I'm not super happy with the quality of the surface tools when dealing with stuff like this. So right now, that's not going to be my approach. I'm going to try to do it all in forms, which is, again, it's going to be a little bit trickier. But you necessarily don't have to follow that same path. You can do one or the other. And then the second thing that I want to say, the second approach is to basically go the same way, is to build these separate, and then to start dividing them and trimming them up so they fit together nicely. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the fender without the wheel opening. We're going to build the wheel opening, and then we're going to combine the two together. The first thing that I want to do is build out the top portion of the fender up to this line. And to do that, I'm going to use the face tool, and I'm going to select Object Snap. So with Object Snap, it'll allow me to snap it to the mesh. Even though we have the mesh set to unselectable or non-selectable, we still will be able to do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to build out four-sided patches. Now this corner here is going to be a little bit tricky. It's likely going to be best handled downstream by trimming away the fender. But for right now, to get started, what I'm going to do is just build these relatively close to major changes in geometry. So that's my first patch. I'm going to bring this, actually I'm going to go about halfway. I'm going to come up to that body line, back to this point. And again, I'm looking for about this transition here. So I'm going to come up to here, down to this transition. And at this point, don't worry too much about the fact that we're snapping to the mesh. And that's simply because that is going to change. So it's going to be a bit tricky to get the section here that's not going to be snapped to the mesh. So what I'm actually going to do is I am going to move over to this other side, and I'm going to start to build the just a couple extra faces over here so that it's not attached. And we'll just do this last one, go all the way to the back of the fender, which is going to come up and back a little bit and go to there. So this gives me a starting point, and if I take a look at the bodies and hide the mesh, I've got two bodies that are not connected. Now, if we look at the mesh itself, I probably want at least one division in the middle there. So I'm going to use Modify and Bridge, and I'm going to go from this edge to this edge here. I'm going to turn the preview on, and I'm going to set the divisions or the number of faces down to 2. And again, make sure that we're going from one to the other, and we're going to say OK. So it's not going to be perfect, but this is going to get me relatively close to that upper shape. Now, as I mentioned, don't worry too much about it actually fitting the fender at this stage. What I actually like to do in a lot of cases is I'll select the body, and I'll bring the fender, the mesh back, and I'm just going to move this out, let's say 1 millimeter or 2 until it exits the form or the mesh. So it looks like 3 millimeters will probably get me a bit closer. Because we don't have any divisions in the middle, it's not going to, it's just going to be basically a straight line from one section to the other. So what I'm going to do, look from the side, and now you can see we've built that sort of upper section. I think it's important that we work in box display. So utilities and display mode, you can go to box display. You can also find this on the edit form dialog. I'm going to make sure I go back to my all selection filter. But under selection options at the very bottom, you can toggle back and forth between the different display modes, or you can use the shortcut on your keyboard for Alt and 3 to go to smooth display and Alt and 1 to go to box display. That's going to be very important moving forward. You want to make sure that you are comfortable with sort of toggling those on and off. Now, it's important at this stage that we're happy with the shape. If we have to make any adjustments to the shape, we want to do it now, because once we start building extra geometry off this, it's going to be much harder to go back and sort of divide things up. So what I want to look at here before I get too far is using the utility make uniform. And I want to make sure that the smooth display maintains a fairly uniform distribution. Now, if we want to adjust these at all, we can always take an edge and use modify and slide edge. Or we can go back and, for example, this one here, I can go to modify and insert edge and move one around. Or I can go to modify and insert point. Let's say I want this to be a little bit more vertical. And then go back and just use delete to get rid of the other one. But at this stage, we want to make sure that everything has a nice transition and nice flow between each edge. We don't want to have any flat sections, and we don't want any drastic changes in curvature. So take a second to look at it from the front, to look at it from the side. So we can see this bottom edge here. On the car, that bottom edge is going to be flat. It's going to be a flat horizontal line. And here it doesn't look like that. So we're going to use modify edit form. I am going to select all of these vertices at the bottom. We could do this a little bit easier with box select and using the vertice selection. And then I want to change my pivot point. So I'm going to move my pivot point to this back corner, which I think is the lowest corner. If I view this from the front, that looks to be probably pretty low. And then I'm going to start to scale these. And it looks like I lost a couple of these. So I'm going to make sure that I hold down Control, select all of them. And from this view, it looks like this one here is the lowest point. So I'm going to set this one as my pivot point, and then I'm going to scale these all down until I'm at 0 and hit enter. So now I have essentially a straight line there. If I bring the mesh back, what I should see is that is relatively straight in relation to the body. Now you can see it's a little bit dipped down here. Remember, we had to do some manual alignment on the scan, so it's not necessarily a perfect line, but this gets us relatively close. To make that adjustment, what I'm going to do is double click the whole line, modify, we're going to change the pivot point to this front, and then we're going to start to rotate it. Now 5 degrees is way too much, but if I go up maybe 0.5 degrees or 0.3 degrees, what we're looking for is we want to get just to the top of that edge here, and we want to scroll into the front and make sure that we're, sort of just at that top of that edge. So once we're happy with that, I'm going to say okay. And now at this point, we can move on to building the lower portion of the fender. So the next step and the next problem that we want to address is this section here where the marker light is missing. So it matches the shape of the fender and the bumper and everything. And what we're going to do downstream is we're going to build the fender over that. And we're going to come back and we're going to cut it away using a sketch and surface tools or solid tools like split body if we need to. So because of that, we're going to build the fender down. But at this stage, a couple things that we need to think about are going to be how many edges we want. I strongly suggest we still work in box display and we assume that each of these edges is going to be a transition, and later on we're going to come back and we're going to add more edges to control that transition. So what I want to do is double click this edge so I have everything selected. I'm going to go to modify edit form. I'm going to do this from the front, and holding down the Alt key is going to allow me to extrude. Now, I can hold down Alt and Control, which will extrude with a creased edge, but then we're going to have to come back and undo that creased edge later. If you really like to work with creased edges and then maybe downstream put a fillet on there once you convert it, that's certainly possible. But since we're going to be blending everything in here inside of the forms tools, then it doesn't really make sense to do that. So I'm going to hold down Alt. I'm going to use the middle icon in my transform mode, which is to move in plane in the XZ plane. And I'm going to pull this down and roughly align it with the body here. So you can see that it's starting to pull in just a little bit here. That's something that we can fix later. Once it's here, I'm going to let go of Alt and I'm going to hold Alt again, and I'm going to pull this out. And I'm not worried about the bumper, but I'm following the body lines here in the front of the fender. So once again, let go of Alt and then press it again. We're going to pull this down. Again, I'm looking to follow the fender, not the bumper. I'm going to do this in 2 steps. Let go of Alt and then press it again. And we'll just come in a little bit here. It's not going to be perfect, but this is going to get us relatively close, and it's going to help us drive the overall shape of the fender. Now, what you will notice is that at the back, it's obviously going to taper down because the way that the fender sort of transitions naturally comes down and then over. So while that edge is still selected, from the side, what I'm going to do is reset my pivot point to the front, and I'm going to rotate this. Now, it's not a perfect solution, but it does help us follow that bumper line. Now, before I deselect anything, I can take this opportunity to move this up a little bit, and then the pivot point is still there, and I just want to rotate it. Now, once again, not a perfect solution. This is just getting us close. The whole point of working in box display is to try to get everything as close as possible. Now, before we do too much more, what I want to do is left click in the canvas area and deselect, because at this point in this transition, I want these edges here. So I'm going to hold down the shift key. I want those edges to start transitioning horizontal. So I'm going to reset the pivot point to that front edge, and then I want to rotate them so that they're essentially horizontal. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to use this opportunity to also move this edge back a little bit, because the fender actually isn't a straight vertical line. Like most cars, there's a little bit of an arc there. So I'm going to take that opportunity to move that back. So overall, that looks pretty good. We are going to just take a quick look at this in smooth display. I don't typically suggest that you get hung up on smooth display at this point. If you hit Alt and 3, you'll notice it really doesn't look anything like the car. And the main reason for that is because we don't have those control edges in here yet, whereas the car has very hard transitions. That's something that we're going to do downstream once we're happy with the overall shape. But it's always important that you start in box display. You start with the lowest number of faces possible to achieve your shape. And I like to work in one direction first. So I went from front to back on the upper portion of the fender, and then I moved from top to bottom. And once I'm happy that I'm relatively close with the overall shape front to back and top to bottom, then I can start adding those extra details in. But you also have to remember that we are going to have to merge this big form surface with another form surface that's going to represent where the fender flare is. At this point, all we're doing is we're trying to match the stock fender, which obviously we're building a wide body, so that doesn't really matter too much. It's just giving us a good reference point. Because at this stage, what I could do is I could take all of these middle faces, all the ones that are not attached to the perimeter, and we could very quickly and easily just use edit form and pull them outward to start to build a wide body. And this is essentially what the factory one looked like with, there are some adjustments that we still need to make over here, but that's essentially what a factory one would be. It would punch itself out like that. There would be an extra edge up here. So I'm going to use Control Z to undo that. But again, this is the process of roughly approximating the starting point. We're not recreating the entire fender, but we're slowly building out those different pieces. Now for this series, I'm going to try to keep each of these videos to about 30 minutes. So we're coming up on that mark now, and I want to make sure that I don't just sit here for hours and hours and hours working through. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit here and we're going to roughly approximate the shape. We want to make sure that we get it relatively close, especially where it's going to attach to the car, which is this upper edge, this front edge, and this edge that's going to be touching the bumper. So the next step for me is to think about that section where it's touching the bumper. And there are a couple ways that we can do this. We can, once again, select the edges that we want to move. We can use the pivot point to set it up here, and then we can rotate it. Or we can use another tool that's pretty handy, and that's going to be insert point. So for insert point, I'm going to start here, and I'm going to draw a line all the way to the bottom edge right there. I'm going to hit enter. Then I'll double click these edges and delete them. Now that pushes it into the bumper or the fender a little bit. So I do want to take those edges. I'm just going to select them. Go to modify, edit form. And from the front, I'm just going to pull them out slightly. You can see right now, I'm not too worried about this roll underneath. Again, we're just roughly approximating what we have. So I can pull this out and up if I feel I need to. Maybe get it a little bit closer. But once again, we are roughly approximating what we have to work with, which now means that we should work on the backside because we just essentially took this straight down, and you can see that there are some gaps on the backside. We can see that this lip here, that transition, has dropped a little bit from where it was up front. If we hide the form body just a little bit, we can kind of see what we're working with. Okay, so once again, one of the big things here is I want to make sure that these lines, the body lines, this line specifically, and this body line go straight back. That's the goal of this part. So I want to make sure that I maintain that and that it matches the underlying body. So from the back, I'm going to take these couple faces and I'm going to move them inward until I feel like they're approximately in the right location. Now, if we use a single direction like X, depending on how far you're zoomed in, it's going to snap to 25 millimeters or 10 millimeters, or if you're really close, it'll snap to 5 millimeters. So you can see here now we're snapping to 5. If you use the in-plane move, so in this case, if I grab this, that is not going to have those large snap points. So it can be very handy to use that. But you want to make sure that you watch the X and the Y numbers because you don't really want to move things up and down too drastically. In this case, it's actually X and Z, but just keeping those in mind. So once again, at this stage, it's not critical that we exactly match everything, but we don't want to be drastically different in the areas where we're attaching to the car. So I'm going to move these back. Again, watching that vertical number, in this case it's Z, I want to keep that number close to 0 if possible, which means I'm only moving back. So that looks pretty good. And this is a great starting point. This is a great building point for us to figure out where everything needs to go. So at this point, I want to make sure that I save this. And I'm going to call this Starion Scan WideBody. You can call it whatever you want, but this way I've got something to work from. So a quick recap in the last couple minutes here is when we're working on a design like this, of a WideBody or anything off of the scan data, when we're trying to use forms, it's important that we stick to the fewest number of faces we feel possible to maintain the shape that we're looking at. We should stick to box display mode. We should try to stay in box display mode until we get to the point where we're happy with the overall shape. And we should really try to keep consistent distances for all of these faces. There are some areas that still need a little bit more work. So for example, this face right here is pretty large compared to the rest. So likely what I'll do is I'll come back and sort of divide this up in this area. But we're mainly looking to get this top edge, this back edge, and this front edge right here to be in approximately the right location to move forward. It is important to note that the location of these edges in smooth display versus box display is not going to be the same. So you can see here that edge moves quite a bit further forward, but that's okay for right now. It's not going to make or break this deal. We want to really focus on box display before we get too far ahead in the design. In the next video, we're going to continue to work on this. We're going to start to talk about getting this out to the position where we want it, and then building that fender lip where it needs to be. So we're going to start to build out a second form body. We're going to push it out to the width that we want to make it, and then we can start to realize the design elements that we're trying to incorporate here. If you want to work on your own design, that's perfect. You can do multiple form bodies inside of the same form workspace. You can also finish the form and create another one, or start a whole new design with the same mesh. But keep in mind that we're not going to cover everything from start to finish, because a design like this does take a good bit of time. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover the basics in a couple of videos, and then I'll likely jump ahead at some point to a more complete version where we begin to hack it up for 3D printing before we actually put it on the car. If you have any questions on what we've done so far, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.